Hey everyone, welcome back to another dive into the darkest corners of medieval history. Before we begin tonight's journey into absolute horror, make sure to hit that like button if you're ready to learn something that'll make you appreciate modern plumbing. And subscribe if you want more stories about the past that'll make your stomach turn. Drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you're watching from, because misery loves company, and we're all about to share some collective disgust. Now, settle in, maybe grab some fresh air while you still can, because we're about to explore what historians agree was quite possibly the most revolting, dangerous, and socially despised job in all of medieval Europe. We're talking about a profession so foul that even executioners looked down on these workers. So disgusting that people would cross streets to avoid them. So horrifying that many cities made it illegal for them to work during daylight hours. Number 1. The most disgusting job of the Middle Ages. What job could possibly be worse than cleaning up after public executions or handling plague victims? Well, meet the Gong farmers. And no, they weren't growing vegetables. The term Gong comes from the Old English word meaning dung, filth, and human waste. These weren't farmers of crops. They were farmers of something far more disturbing. Picture this scenario. It's 1347 in London, and you're walking down a narrow cobblestone street when suddenly the most overwhelming, nauseating smell hits your nostrils. It's not just bad. It's the kind of smell that makes your eyes water, your throat close up, and your stomach immediately revolt. You look around desperately trying to find the source, and then you see them. A group of men covered head to toe in brown, sticky filth, carrying buckets that seem to be steaming in the cold night air. These are the Gong farmers, and they're carrying out what might be the most essential, yet most revolting work in the entire medieval world. Without them, every city would have collapsed under the weight of its own waste within months. They were the unsung heroes of medieval sanitation, the men who quite literally kept civilization from drowning in its own excrement. But here's what makes their story even more fascinating and disturbing. These weren't desperate people doing whatever they could to survive. Many Gong farmers were actually well-paid professionals who earned more than skilled craftsmen, teachers, or even some merchants. They were so essential to city life that they often had waiting lists of people wanting to hire them. Yet they were so socially despised that they couldn't enter taverns, marry outside their profession, or even be buried in regular cemeteries. Tonight, we're going to explore every stomach-churning detail of their daily lives. How they worked, what tools they used, the deadly dangers they faced every single night, and why medieval society both desperately needed them and completely rejected them. We'll discover how a job involving human waste became one of the most regulated professions in medieval Europe, and why these men quite literally saved medieval cities from complete collapse. So if you thought your job was bad, if you've ever complained about your working conditions, or if you've ever wondered what the absolute worst career choice in history might have been, stick around. Because by the end of this journey, you'll have a whole new appreciation for modern sanitation, and you'll never look at a bathroom the same way again. Fair warning though, this isn't going to be pretty. We're diving deep into the most disgusting aspects of medieval life, the parts that most history books skip over completely. But these stories matter because they show us just how different life was back then and how lucky we are to live in an age of running water and sewage treatment plants. The Gong farmers were the reality of medieval life stripped of all romance and glamour. They were proof that even in the so-called good old days, someone had to deal with the mess everyone else made. And tonight, we're going to meet them face to face. Number 2. What exactly was a Gong farmer? Let's start with the basics, because the term Gong farmer is probably more disgusting than you realize. The word Gong didn't mean what you think it means. It wasn't some medieval percussion instrument or a mysterious farming technique. No, Gong comes from the Old English term meaning dung, filth, and specifically human excrement. So a Gong farmer wasn't farming anything that grew in soil. They were farming something that came from human bodies. These were professional waste removal specialists, the medieval equivalent of sewage workers. Except imagine if sewage workers had to climb down into pits of human waste without any protective equipment, breathing in toxic fumes that could kill them instantly, and doing all of this by torchlight in the middle of the night. That's a Gong farmer. But here's where it gets more specific and more revolting. Gong farmers weren't just cleaning up random waste from the streets. Their primary job was to clean out what medieval people called privies, which were basically toilets built over deep pits. Imagine a wooden box with a hole in it, built over a pit that could be anywhere from 6 to 20 feet deep, and filled with months or even years' worth of human waste from entire households, inns, monasteries, or castles. These pits, called cesspits or gong pits, would fill up over time with layer upon layer of human excrement, urine, and whatever else people threw down there. Food scraps, dead rats, sometimes even unwanted babies or murder victims. The smell was so intense that people living near full pits often got sick just from breathing the air. The waste would ferment and create gases so toxic that they could kill a man within minutes. When a pit got too full, when the smell became absolutely unbearable, or when waste started backing up into people's homes, that's when they called the Gong farmers. These men would arrive in the dead of night, remove the wooden toilet seat and whatever covering was over the pit, and then begin the horrifying process of emptying out months or years' worth of accumulated human waste. But the job title itself reveals something interesting about medieval society. By calling them farmers, the culture was trying to make the job sound more respectable than it actually was. Farming was an honorable profession, something that fed people and supported society. So by using the term Gong farmer, they were acknowledging that this work was essential, even if it was disgusting. The term also reveals how medieval people thought about waste disposal. They saw it as a kind of harvesting, a necessary collection of something that had accumulated over time. Just like a grain farmer would harvest wheat when it was ready, a gong farmer would harvest waste when the pits were full. It was agricultural language applied to the most non-agricultural job imaginable. Different regions had different names for these workers. In some parts of England, they were called night soil men because they worked at night collecting what people politely called night soil. In France, they might be called vidangeurs, which literally means emptiers. In Germanic regions, they had even more colorful names that basically translated to dung diggers or cesspit cleaners. But regardless of what they were called, their job remained the same across medieval Europe. They were the men who went where no one else would go, who handled what no one else would handle, and who did work that everyone else found absolutely revolting. They were professional waste collectors in an age before any real understanding of sanitation, hygiene, or disease transmission. What makes their profession even more interesting is that it was highly regulated. You couldn't just decide to become a gong farmer. In many cities, you needed licenses, permits, and official approval. There were strict rules about when they could work, where they could dump the waste, and even what tools they could use. This wasn't some desperate last resort job for people who had no other options. It was a legitimate profession with its own rules, regulations, and professional standards. The fact that medieval society created an entire professional class dedicated to waste removal shows just how serious the problem was. Without gong farmers, medieval cities would have been uninhabitable. The accumulation of human waste would have made them breeding grounds for disease, created smells so overwhelming that no one could function, and turned every urban area into a health disaster. So when we talk about gong farmers, we're not talking about some odd historical footnote. We're talking about men who were absolutely essential to medieval civilization, who performed work so disgusting that most people couldn't even think about it, but who were so important that entire cities depended on them for survival. Number 3. Medieval toilets explained. Before we can truly understand just how horrible a gong farmer's job was, we need to talk about medieval toilets. And trust me, once you understand what these toilets were actually like, you'll realize that gong farming wasn't just unpleasant work, it was like descending into the depths of hell on a nightly basis. Forget everything you know about modern bathrooms. There was no porcelain, no running water, no flush mechanisms, and definitely no toilet paper. Medieval toilets were basically wooden boxes with holes in them, built over pits that were dug directly into the ground. Imagine a really uncomfortable chair with no back, made of rough wooden planks, with a hole cut in the middle that opened directly into a pit of human waste below. These contraptions were called privies, and they were usually built in the back corners of properties, as far away from living spaces as possible. But in crowded medieval cities, as far away as possible might only be a few feet from someone's kitchen window. The wealthy might have privies built over larger pits, or even multiple privies for different family members. The poor might share a single privy with multiple families, creating pits that filled up incredibly quickly with waste from dozens of people. Now here's where it gets really disgusting. These pits weren't lined with anything. They were just holes dug directly into the dirt, which meant that waste would seep into the surrounding soil, contaminate groundwater, and create a spreading zone of filth around each toilet. In cities where houses were built close together, you might have dozens of these pits all in the same neighborhood, creating an underground network of sewage that would make the entire area reek. The pits varied in size, but most were between 6 and 15 feet deep and maybe 4 to 6 feet wide. That might not sound like much, but imagine a hole that deep, completely filled with human excrement, rotting food scraps, and whatever else people threw down there. The waste would pile up layer by layer, month after month, creating a horrifying archaeological record of everything that had passed through people's digestive systems. But it gets worse. These weren't just toilets for human waste. Medieval people used their privies like garbage disposals. Food scraps, dead animals, broken pottery, old clothes, and basically anything they wanted to get rid of would go down the privy. Sometimes people would even dump unwanted babies or dispose of murder victims by throwing them into privy pits. So when Gong farmers went to work, they never knew what they might find buried in the waste. The smell from these pits was beyond description. We're not talking about the kind of bad smell you might experience from a clogged modern toilet. This was the concentrated stench of months or years' worth of rotting human waste, fermenting in an underground pit, creating gases so toxic they could burn your throat and make your eyes water from hundreds of feet away. Medieval people tried to control the smell by covering their privies with wooden lids or by throwing lime, ash, or herbs down into the pits. Some wealthy households would pay servants to regularly sprinkle sweet-smelling herbs around their privies. But nothing could really contain the overwhelming stench of a full cesspit. When the wind was wrong, the smell from a neighborhood's worth of privies could make entire streets uninhabitable. The toilets themselves were uncomfortable and dangerous. The wooden seats were often rough, splintery, and covered with waste. There was no lighting, so people used privies in complete darkness or by the light of a single candle or torch, which created fire hazards. The wooden platforms were slippery and unstable, and people occasionally fell through broken boards directly into the waste pit below. In castles and wealthy homes, privies might be built into the walls, with chutes that carried waste down to pits or directly into moats or rivers. These were called garderobes, and while they were slightly more comfortable than outdoor privies, they still opened directly into pits of accumulated waste. Some castle garderobes were built on upper floors, with long chutes that carried waste down to ground-level pits, which meant that when those pits were full, Gong farmers would have to clean out waste that had been falling from multiple stories for months. Public privies in cities were even more horrifying. These were shared toilets used by dozens or hundreds of people, with massive pits that could be 20 or 30 feet deep and filled with waste from entire neighborhoods. The public privies were usually the worst-smelling, most disgusting places in any medieval city, and they were where Gong farmers did their most dangerous and revolting work. What made these toilets even more dangerous was the gases they produced. Human waste, when it ferments in underground pits, creates hydrogen sulfide, methane, and other toxic gases that can kill people almost instantly. Medieval people didn't understand the science behind these gases, but they knew that spending too much time near a full privy could make you sick or even kill you. Some people died just from cleaning their own privies, overcome by fumes before they could escape. So when we talk about what Gong farmers had to clean out, we're talking about these horrifying pits of accumulated waste, toxic gases, rotting garbage, and sometimes dead bodies. These weren't simple toilets that needed a quick cleaning. These were underground chambers of horror that required someone brave enough or desperate enough to climb down into them and remove their contents by hand. Number 4. A Gong farmer's daily routine. Now let's talk about what a Gong farmer actually did during a typical night of work, because their daily routine was like something out of a nightmare. And yes, I said night, because Gong farmers were legally required to work in darkness. Medieval cities didn't want people seeing what these men had to do, and they definitely didn't want the general public exposed to the full horror of waste removal during daylight hours. A Gong farmer's workday began around midnight and usually lasted until just before dawn. They would meet at predetermined locations, often outside the city walls, where they kept their tools and equipment stored in sheds that were too smelly to be kept anywhere near where people lived. The smell of their workplace was so intense that it could be detected from miles away on a still night. The first step was getting dressed, though dressed is probably the wrong word. Gong farmers wore the oldest, most disposable clothes they could find, because everything they wore would be completely contaminated by the end of their shift. Most wore multiple layers of old rags, strips of cloth wrapped around their arms and legs, and whatever they could find to cover their heads and faces. Some tried to smear their skin with animal fat or oils, hoping it would create a barrier between their flesh and the waste they would be handling. But here's the thing that makes their work even more horrible. They didn't have any real protective equipment. No rubber gloves, no gas masks, no hazmat suits. They worked with their bare hands, breathing unfiltered air, completely exposed to whatever diseases and toxins were lurking in the waste pits. The closest thing they had to protection was maybe wrapping rags around their faces, but that did almost nothing against the overwhelming fumes and contamination. Once they were as prepared as they could be, the Gong farmers would load their tools onto carts and head into the city. They moved through the streets like ghosts, trying to avoid being seen by anyone. If people spotted them coming, windows would slam shut, doors would be barred, and entire neighborhoods would try to seal themselves off from the smell that followed the Gong farmers wherever they went. When they arrived at a job site, whether it was a private home, an inn, a monastery, or a public privy, the real work began. The first step was removing whatever covering was over the cesspit. This might be wooden boards, a stone slab, or just piles of dirt and debris that had been thrown over the pit to try to contain the smell. As soon as the pit was uncovered, a wave of toxic fumes would escape that could knock a person unconscious. The Gong farmers had to work quickly, both because of the dangerous gases and because they needed to finish before dawn. They would set up their equipment around the pit, usually a series of buckets, ropes, and long-handled tools. Then came the moment every Gong farmer dreaded. Someone had to go down into the pit. Picture this scene. A hole in the ground, anywhere from 6 to 20 feet deep, filled with years' worth of human excrement that had been fermenting and rotting in the darkness. The waste wouldn't be liquid. It would be a thick, sticky, horrible mixture of solid and semi-solid material, filled with things that had been thrown down the privy over months or years. The smell rising from the pit would be so intense that it would cause immediate vomiting for anyone not used to it. The Gong farmer would tie a rope around his waist, grab a bucket and a shovel, and lower himself down into this nightmare. Once at the bottom, he would begin the process of filling bucket after bucket with waste, using his hands when the shovel couldn't get into corners or handle the consistency of the material. His fellow workers above would pull up each bucket using ropes, dump the contents into larger containers or directly onto carts, and send the bucket back down. This process could take hours for a single pit. The Gong farmer working in the pit would be completely covered in waste, breathing air so toxic it would burn his lungs, and working in conditions so revolting that many people would lose consciousness just from the smell. Meanwhile, his partners above would be hauling bucket after bucket of human excrement, trying not to spill any on themselves, and dealing with the overwhelming stench that would cling to their clothes and skin for days. But the work didn't end when the pit was empty. The waste had to be transported somewhere, usually outside the city walls to designated dumping areas. This meant loading carts with containers full of human excrement and hauling them through city streets, leaving a trail of smell and contamination wherever they went. The carts would be so heavy that it often took multiple men to move them, and the contents would slosh and spill with every bump in the road. The final step was cleaning up, though cleaning up after a night of Gong farming was almost impossible. The workers would try to wash themselves and their tools with whatever water was available, but the smell and contamination would persist for days. Their clothes would have to be burned or buried. Their tools would remain contaminated no matter how much they were scrubbed, and the men themselves would carry the stench with them wherever they went. By dawn, the Gong farmers would disappear back to their storage areas outside the city, exhausted, contaminated, and reeking of human waste. They would try to rest during the day, preparing for another night of the same horrifying work. And this routine would continue night after night, pit after pit, because the waste never stopped accumulating and someone had to remove it. Number 5. Tools and techniques. Let's talk about the tools and techniques Gong farmers used, because their equipment was both ingeniously practical and absolutely horrifying to imagine using. These weren't sophisticated machines or advanced technology. These were basic hand tools that had to function in some of the most disgusting conditions imaginable, handled by men who were literally wading through human waste in the darkness. The most essential tool was the bucket, but not just any bucket. Gong farmers used specially designed containers that were deeper and wider than normal buckets, often made from wood or leather that could hold large amounts of waste without breaking apart. These buckets had reinforced handles and were designed to be filled with heavy, sticky material that wouldn't pour easily. Many had flat bottoms so they would sit stable in the waste pit, and wide mouths so they could be filled quickly with shovels or by hand. But here's what made these buckets particularly horrifying. After months or years of use, they would become permanently contaminated with waste that had soaked into the wood or leather. The smell would be so embedded in the material that no amount of cleaning could remove it. Gong farmers often owned dozens of these buckets because they would wear out quickly or become so contaminated that they had to be destroyed. The second most important tool was the shovel, but these weren't ordinary shovels like you might use in a garden. Gong farmer shovels had long handles, sometimes 6 or 8 feet long, so the worker could reach deep into pits without having to climb all the way down. The blades were often wider and flatter than normal shovels, designed to scoop up semi-liquid waste that would slide off regular tools. Some Gong farmers used specialized scoops that looked more like giant ladles, with deep bowls that could hold large amounts of waste. Others preferred flat-bladed tools that could scrape waste off the walls and bottom of pits. The handles were often wrapped with rags or leather to provide better grip, because the tools would become slippery with contamination during use. Ropes were absolutely essential, both for lowering workers into pits and for hauling up buckets of waste. These ropes had to be strong enough to support a man's weight plus heavy buckets of waste, but they also had to be cheap enough to replace regularly, because they would become so contaminated that they couldn't be used for anything else. Gong farmers often used hemp rope that was thick and sturdy, but which would absorb smells and contamination that could never be completely removed. One of the most ingenious tools was the Gong ladder, a specialized ladder designed specifically for climbing in and out of waste pits. These ladders were often made from wood that could be easily replaced, with wide rungs that provided stable footing even when covered in waste. Some had hooks or spikes that could be driven into the walls of pits to provide extra stability. But the most dangerous aspect of these ladders was that they would become incredibly slippery and unstable once contaminated with waste. Gong farmers developed techniques for cleaning the rungs as they climbed, but many accidents happened when workers lost their footing on contaminated ladders and fell back into the pits they were trying to escape. For transportation, Gong farmers used specially constructed carts that were designed to carry large loads of liquid waste without spilling. These carts had high sides, often lined with leather or pitched cloth to prevent leakage. Some had covers that could be pulled over the load to contain the smell, though this did little to actually hide what they were carrying. The wheels of these carts were often wrapped with rags or leather to muffle the sound, because Gong farmers were supposed to work quietly and avoid drawing attention to themselves. The carts also had to be built low and wide, because the weight of the waste would make them difficult to balance and prone to tipping over. One of the most specialized tools was the Gong rake, a long-handled rake with closely spaced tines that could break up solid waste and pull debris out of pits. These rakes were essential for dealing with waste that had been sitting in pits for years and had formed hard, crusty layers that couldn't be removed with shovels or buckets alone. Lighting was another major challenge. Gong farmers worked in complete darkness, but they needed some light to see what they were doing. They used lanterns with thick glass or horn panels that could be closed quickly if the light attracted unwanted attention. Some used torches, though these were dangerous around the toxic gases that rose from waste pits. The most ingenious lighting solution was the Gong farmer's candle, a specially designed candle that burned with a low, steady flame and was made with materials that wouldn't be extinguished by the humid, toxic air around waste pits. These candles were often made with animal fat and wicks treated with chemicals that would burn even in difficult conditions. For personal protection, Gong farmers developed their own techniques and equipment. Some wrapped their feet and legs with leather strips to protect against cuts and contamination. Others wore specially made boots that could be thrown away after each job. Many carried small containers of strong-smelling herbs or oils that they would sniff to try to counteract the overwhelming smell of the waste. But perhaps the most important technique was the buddy system. Gong farmers almost always worked in teams, with one man in the pit and at least one partner above ground. This was essential for safety, because the gases from waste pits could cause unconsciousness or death within minutes. The partner above would watch for signs of distress and be ready to pull the worker out of the pit if he was overcome by fumes. The techniques for actually removing waste were developed through trial and error over generations. Experienced Gong farmers knew how to break up different types of waste, how to work efficiently in confined spaces, and how to minimize their exposure to the most dangerous materials. They developed methods for testing the air in pits before entering, techniques for moving quickly through the work, and ways to clean themselves and their tools afterward. Number 6. Risks and dangers of the job. Now we need to talk about just how dangerous Gong farming actually was, because this wasn't just disgusting work, it was work that could kill you in multiple horrible ways. Gong farmers faced death every single night they went to work, and many of them didn't live to see old age. The mortality rate for Gong farmers was higher than for soldiers in active combat, and the ways they could die were often more horrible than anything you'd see on a battlefield. The most immediate danger was suffocation from toxic gases. When human waste ferments in closed pits for months or years, it produces hydrogen sulfide, methane, carbon dioxide, and other gases that can kill a person almost instantly. Hydrogen sulfide, which smells like rotten eggs, can cause unconsciousness in seconds and death within minutes. Methane can displace oxygen in confined spaces, causing suffocation without any warning signs. Medieval people didn't understand the science behind these gases, but they knew that spending time near waste pits was deadly. Gong farmers developed crude techniques for testing the air before entering a pit, like lowering a lit candle to see if the flame would be extinguished by gases, but these methods were far from foolproof. Many Gong farmers would climb into a pit, take a few breaths of toxic air, and simply collapse unconscious into the waste below. What made gas poisoning even more horrifying was that it often happened without warning. A Gong farmer might be working normally one moment, then suddenly overcome by fumes the next. His partner above would see him collapse into the waste pit, but attempting a rescue was incredibly dangerous because the gases that killed the first worker were still present. Many Gong farmers died trying to rescue their partners from gas-filled pits. The second major danger was drowning in waste. This sounds almost impossible to believe, but waste pits often contained liquid and semi-liquid material that was deep enough to drown in. If a Gong farmer fell unconscious from gas poisoning while working in a deep pit, he could easily drown in the waste before his partners could pull him out. Some pits contained waste that was so thick and sticky that a person could become trapped in it, unable to move or climb out. There are documented cases of Gong farmers disappearing into waste pits and never being recovered, their bodies lost forever in the depths of accumulated human excrement. The waste in some pits was so deep and viscous that it was impossible to search for victims, and families would never know what happened to their loved ones who went to work one night and simply vanished. Disease was another constant threat. Gong farmers were exposed to every illness that had passed through the digestive systems of entire communities. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, plague, parasites, and countless other diseases were concentrated in the waste they handled every night. They worked with their bare hands, breathed contaminated air, and often had open cuts and wounds that provided direct pathways for infection. The mortality rate from disease among Gong farmers was staggering. Many didn't die immediately from acute poisoning or accidents, but rather from slow, wasting diseases they contracted through constant exposure to contaminated waste. They would develop chronic diarrhea, fevers, respiratory problems, and skin conditions that would gradually weaken them until they died. Physical injuries were also common. Gong farmers worked in darkness, in slippery conditions, with contaminated tools, around unstable structures. They regularly cut themselves on broken pottery or metal objects that had been thrown into waste pits. They fell from ladders, were struck by falling debris, and suffered injuries from handling heavy buckets and equipment in difficult conditions. But here's what made injuries particularly dangerous for Gong farmers. Any cut or wound would immediately become contaminated with waste, leading to serious infections that were often fatal in an age before antibiotics. A simple cut on the hand could develop into a life-threatening infection within days. Many Gong farmers died not from major accidents, but from infected wounds that started as minor injuries. The psychological dangers were also severe. Working in such horrifying conditions, night after night, took a terrible toll on mental health. Many Gong farmers developed what we would now recognize as PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorders. They had nightmares, couldn't eat normally, and often turned to alcohol to cope with the trauma of their work. The social isolation made the psychological damage worse. Gong farmers were shunned by society, couldn't form normal relationships, and were excluded from most social activities. They lived in a world where they were essential but despised, needed but rejected. This isolation, combined with the horror of their daily work, led many to suicide or mental breakdown. Fire was another constant danger. Gong farmers worked with open flames for lighting, around gases that could explode without warning. Methane gas is highly flammable, and many waste pits contained enough methane to create serious explosion hazards. If a torch or lantern came into contact with methane-filled air, the resulting explosion could kill everyone in the vicinity and destroy surrounding buildings. There are records of waste pit explosions that killed Gong farmers and caused extensive property damage. Some cities banned the use of open flames around waste pits, but this made the work even more dangerous because workers had to operate in complete darkness. Weather made all these dangers worse. Rain would fill pits with water, creating deeper drowning hazards and washing contaminated material into the surrounding area. Cold weather would make equipment more likely to break and workers more prone to accidents. Hot weather would increase the concentration of toxic gases and make the smell so overwhelming that workers would become nauseous and disoriented. The equipment itself was dangerous. Ropes would break under the weight of heavy buckets, sending workers crashing into waste pits. Ladders would collapse or become too slippery to use safely. Buckets would split apart, spilling waste onto workers below. Tools would break at critical moments, leaving workers trapped in dangerous situations. What made all these dangers worse was that there was no medical care available for Gong farmers. Doctors wouldn't treat them because of the contamination and disease risk. Hospitals wouldn't admit them because of the smell and social stigma. If a Gong farmer was injured or became sick, he was largely on his own, with only his fellow workers to help him. Number 7. Pay and social status. Here's where the story of Gong farmers gets really interesting and reveals one of the strangest contradictions in medieval society. Despite doing the most disgusting, dangerous, and socially despised work imaginable, Gong farmers were actually among the highest paid workers in medieval cities. We're talking about men who earned more money than skilled craftsmen, teachers, clerks, and even some merchants, yet who were treated as social outcasts and couldn't spend their money in most establishments. In 14th century London, a typical laborer might earn 2 or 3 pence per day. A skilled carpenter or mason might earn 4 to 6 pence daily. But a Gong farmer could earn anywhere from 12 pence to 2 shillings per day, which was enormous money for the time period. Some particularly experienced Gong farmers who worked the largest and most dangerous pits could earn even more, sometimes making in a single night what other workers made in a week. But here's the catch that made their high wages almost meaningless. Gong farmers couldn't spend their money like normal people. They were banned from most taverns, shops, and markets during daylight hours. Many merchants wouldn't sell to them at all, fearing that association with Gong farmers would hurt their reputation. When Gong farmers did manage to buy things, they often had to pay higher prices because sellers demanded extra compensation for dealing with their smell and social contamination. The high wages weren't really a sign of respect or appreciation. They were hazard pay, compensation for doing work that was so dangerous and disgusting that most people would literally rather starve than do it. Cities paid high wages because they absolutely had to have this work done, but they couldn't find people willing to do it for normal wages. The money was basically a bribe to get people to risk their lives and health in the most revolting job imaginable. But even with high wages, most Gong farmers remained poor throughout their lives. The nature of their work meant they had enormous expenses that other workers didn't face. They had to constantly replace contaminated clothing, tools, and equipment. They needed extra food because the physical demands of their work were enormous. They often had higher medical expenses because of the health problems caused by their occupation. Many Gong farmers also spent large portions of their income on alcohol, which was one of the few ways they could cope with the psychological trauma of their work. Taverns outside the city walls, or disreputable establishments that would serve anyone, became gathering places for Gong farmers where they could drink away their memories of each night's horror. The social status of Gong farmers was complicated in ways that reveal the contradictions of medieval society. On one hand, their work was absolutely essential. Cities couldn't function without them. When Gong farmers went on strike or refused to work in certain areas, the results were immediate and catastrophic. Waste would back up, diseases would spread, and entire neighborhoods would become uninhabitable within weeks. Yet at the same time, Gong farmers were treated as the lowest of the low in the social hierarchy. They ranked below serfs, below beggars, below prostitutes, below criminals. In some cities, they were legally classified alongside executioners, grave robbers, and other dishonorable professions that placed people outside normal society. This created a strange situation where Gong farmers were simultaneously indispensable and despised. City officials would negotiate with them, pay them well, and rely on them completely, but they would also create laws restricting where Gong farmers could live, when they could appear in public, and how they could conduct their business. Marriage was particularly difficult for Gong farmers. Most people wouldn't allow their daughters to marry Gong farmers, regardless of how much money they made. Gong farming families often had to intermarry with each other, creating dynasties of waste removal specialists who passed their profession down through generations because they had few other options. Women connected to Gong farmers also faced social ostracism. The wives and daughters of Gong farmers were often treated as contaminated by association, banned from certain social activities, and excluded from normal community life. This meant that Gong farming families lived in their own isolated social world, separate from the rest of medieval society. The children of Gong farmers faced particular challenges. They were often automatically excluded from apprenticeships in respectable trades, couldn't attend schools with other children, and were pushed toward following their fathers into the same profession. This created a hereditary caste of waste workers who had little opportunity to escape their social position. Some Gong farmers tried to use their high earnings to buy their way into respectability. They would purchase better clothing, larger houses, or try to start other businesses. But their past as Gong farmers would follow them everywhere, and most attempts to escape their social position failed completely. The smell was part of the problem. Even when Gong farmers bathed, changed clothes, and tried to clean themselves, the stench of their work would cling to them for days. People could identify a Gong farmer by smell alone, even when he was dressed in fine clothing and trying to blend in with respectable society. The contamination seemed to seep into their very skin, marking them as permanently different from normal people. Religious institutions also discriminated against Gong farmers. Many churches wouldn't allow them to attend services or would force them to stand in special sections separate from other worshippers. Some priests refused to perform marriages, baptisms, or funerals for Gong farmers, viewing them as spiritually contaminated by their association with human filth. When Gong farmers died, they were often buried in separate sections of cemeteries, or even in completely different burial grounds. The legal system treated Gong farmers differently as well. Their testimony in court was often given less weight than that of other citizens. Some cities had laws that specifically restricted where Gong farmers could live, requiring them to stay in certain neighborhoods away from respectable areas. They were banned from many guilds and professional organizations, cutting them off from the normal pathways to social advancement. Yet despite all this discrimination, Gong farmers developed their own communities and support networks. They formed informal guilds that protected their interests, negotiated with city officials, and maintained standards for their profession. They created their own social gatherings, marriages within their community, and ways of supporting each other through the difficulties of their work and social position. Some cities recognized the importance of Gong farmers by granting them special privileges to offset their social stigma. They might be exempt from certain taxes, given priority access to certain markets, or allowed to work in other occupations during daylight hours. These privileges were attempts to retain skilled Gong farmers and prevent them from leaving for other cities that offered better treatment. The contradiction between high wages and low social status created a unique class of workers who were wealthy but powerless, essential but despised, needed but rejected. They lived in a parallel society within medieval cities, operating by different rules and facing different challenges than any other group of workers. Number 8. Rules and laws governing Gong farmers. Medieval cities didn't just tolerate Gong farmers, they heavily regulated them. The work they did was so essential to urban survival, yet so potentially dangerous to public health and social order, that city governments created extensive legal frameworks specifically for controlling waste removal. These laws reveal both how desperately cities needed Gong farmers and how much they feared the consequences of their work. The most universal law governing Gong farmers was the night work requirement. In virtually every major medieval city, Gong farmers were legally prohibited from working during daylight hours. This wasn't just social courtesy, it was criminal law enforced with serious penalties. Gong farmers caught working during the day could be fined, imprisoned, or even banished from the city. The reasoning was partly practical and partly social. During the day, the sight and smell of Gong farmers at work would disrupt commerce, cause public health problems, and generally horrify the population. But the night work requirement created its own problems. Working in complete darkness made an already dangerous job even more deadly. Gong farmers couldn't see the hazards they were facing, couldn't properly assess the safety of waste pits, and were more likely to have accidents that could kill them or contaminate surrounding areas. The law essentially forced Gong farmers to choose between legal compliance and personal safety. Different cities had different specific rules about timing. London required Gong farmers to begin work after midnight and finish before dawn. Paris allowed them to start earlier, but demanded they be completely finished and out of sight before the morning church bells rang. Some German cities were even more restrictive, allowing Gong farming only during the darkest hours around midnight, giving workers just a few hours to complete jobs that might normally take all night. The laws governing where waste could be dumped were equally strict and complex. Gong farmers couldn't just dispose of waste anywhere convenient. Most cities designated specific dumping areas, usually far outside the city walls, where waste could be deposited without contaminating water sources or agricultural areas. These dumping grounds were often miles from the city center, requiring Gong farmers to transport heavy loads of waste over long distances in the middle of the night. Some cities required Gong farmers to bury the waste rather than just dumping it on the surface. Others demanded that waste be mixed with lime or other materials to reduce smell and disease risk. Many cities prohibited dumping waste near rivers, wells, or other water sources, even if those locations would have been much more convenient for disposal. The transportation of waste was also heavily regulated. Gong farmers had to use covered carts to prevent waste from spilling or splattering on city streets. They were required to take specific routes that avoided market areas, residential neighborhoods, and religious sites. Some cities designated certain streets as Gong farmer routes that could only be used by waste removal workers, keeping them separate from normal traffic. Speed limits were enforced for Gong farmer carts. They had to move slowly enough to prevent spills and accidents, but fast enough to complete their work within the limited time windows allowed. Some cities stationed guards along Gong farmer routes to ensure compliance with transportation regulations and to prevent unauthorized dumping. The licensing and registration of Gong farmers was surprisingly sophisticated for medieval bureaucracy. Most cities required Gong farmers to obtain official permits before they could work. These licenses often specified exactly what work they were authorized to perform, which areas of the city they could serve, and what methods they were required to use. The licensing process usually involved background checks to ensure that Gong farmers weren't criminals or political troublemakers who might use their access to private properties for illegal purposes. Some cities required Gong farmers to post bonds or provide guarantees that they would follow all regulations and complete their work properly. Licenses had to be renewed regularly, often annually, and the renewal process included inspections of equipment, tools, and working methods. Cities wanted to ensure that Gong farmers were using safe, effective techniques that wouldn't create additional problems. Unlicensed Gong farming was a serious crime that could result in heavy fines or imprisonment. The regulation of prices and payment was another complex area of law. Some cities set fixed rates that Gong farmers could charge, preventing them from taking advantage of desperate customers who had no choice but to hire them. Other cities allowed market pricing but required detailed record-keeping of all transactions to prevent fraud and ensure proper tax collection. Payment disputes between Gong farmers and their customers were handled by special courts that dealt specifically with sanitation issues. These courts had to balance the legitimate interests of customers who wanted quality work against the practical realities of what Gong farmers could reasonably be expected to accomplish. Quality standards were surprisingly detailed. Cities specified how thoroughly waste pits had to be cleaned, what materials could be left behind, and how the work site had to be restored after cleaning. Gong farmers who did sloppy work could lose their licenses or face criminal charges for public health violations. Some cities required Gong farmers to provide warranties for their work, guaranteeing that clean pits would remain functional for specific periods of time. If waste backed up or problems developed soon after cleaning, the Gong farmer might be required to return and fix the problem at no additional charge. The laws also covered the behavior and appearance of Gong farmers themselves. Many cities prohibited Gong farmers from entering taverns, markets, or other public spaces during their off hours, fearing that their contamination would spread to other people. Some required Gong farmers to wear identifying clothing or badges so they could be easily recognized and avoided by the general public. Residence restrictions were common. Gong farmers might be prohibited from living in certain neighborhoods, required to live outside city walls, or forced to maintain their homes and workshops in designated areas away from respectable districts. These zoning laws were early forms of residential segregation based on occupation. The penalties for violating Gong farmer regulations were severe. Fines could be enormous by medieval standards, sometimes equal to months or years of normal wages. Repeat offenders could be banned from the profession entirely, which was essentially an economic death sentence for people who had few other employment options. Some cities used corporal punishment for serious violations. Gong farmers who contaminated water sources, dumped waste in unauthorized areas, or caused public health emergencies could face whipping, branding, or even mutilation. The most serious violations could result in banishment or execution, though these extreme penalties were rarely actually imposed. The complexity of these laws reveals how seriously medieval cities took waste management. This wasn't just a matter of hiring someone to clean up a mess. It was a sophisticated system of public health regulation that required careful coordination between city governments, property owners, and waste removal specialists. Number 9. Impact on medieval cities. The work of Gong farmers had an impact on medieval cities that's almost impossible to overstate. Without these men willing to do the most disgusting job imaginable, urban civilization in medieval Europe would have literally collapsed under the weight of its own waste. Cities would have become uninhabitable disease-ridden hellscapes where no one could survive for more than a few months. Gong farmers weren't just cleaning up messes, they were making urban life possible. To understand their impact, you need to imagine what would happen if Gong farmers simply stopped working. Within weeks, every privy in a city would overflow. Human waste would back up into homes, spill onto streets, and contaminate every water source. The smell would become so overwhelming that people couldn't function normally. Disease would spread rapidly through populations that were already living in close proximity with limited medical care. This isn't theoretical speculation. There are historical records of what happened when Gong farmer services were disrupted. During plague outbreaks, when many Gong farmers died or fled cities, waste management systems collapsed completely. The resulting sanitation crises made the plague even worse, creating cycles of disease and death that could devastate entire urban populations. In 1348, during the Black Death pandemic, several English cities lost so many Gong farmers that waste removal essentially stopped. Contemporary accounts describe streets running with human waste, homes becoming uninhabitable as privies overflowed, and the smell becoming so intense that people couldn't leave their houses. The breakdown of waste management contributed significantly to the spread of disease and the social collapse that followed. But when Gong farmers were working properly, their impact was transformational. Cities with effective waste management systems could support much larger populations than those without. London, Paris, and other major medieval cities were able to grow to sizes that would have been impossible without professional waste removal. The availability of Gong farmer services was actually a limiting factor in urban development. The economic impact was enormous. Property values were directly tied to access to Gong farmer services. Homes and businesses near regularly cleaned privies were worth significantly more than those in areas where waste accumulated. Neighborhoods that couldn't afford regular Gong farmer services would quickly become slums where property values collapsed and respectable people moved away. Commercial districts depended heavily on Gong farmers. Markets, inns, workshops, and other businesses generated waste that had to be removed regularly to keep them functional. A single inn might need Gong farmer services monthly, while a busy market district might require daily waste removal. Without this service, commercial areas would quickly become unusable. The impact on public health was the most important aspect of Gong farmer work. Medieval people didn't understand the connection between waste and disease the way we do now, but they knew from experience that areas with better waste management had fewer illness outbreaks. Cities with effective Gong farmer services had lower rates of cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and other waste-related diseases. Gong farmers also played a crucial role in preventing contamination of water supplies. By removing waste from areas near wells, rivers, and other water sources, they helped ensure that drinking water remained relatively clean. This was particularly important in crowded cities where water sources were already stressed, and any contamination could affect thousands of people. The social impact was complex. On one hand, Gong farmers enabled the growth of urban communities by making dense living arrangements possible. Without waste management, people would have been forced to live in much smaller, more spread-out settlements. On the other hand, the existence of a despised class of waste workers reinforced social hierarchies and created new forms of discrimination and exclusion. Gong farmers influenced city planning in ways that are still visible today. The location of waste disposal areas, the design of streets and alleys, and even the layout of residential neighborhoods were all affected by the practical requirements of waste removal. Many medieval city features that seem arbitrary to modern observers were actually designed around the logistics of Gong farmer operations. The impact on urban governance was significant. Cities had to develop new forms of regulation, licensing, and public health management specifically to deal with waste removal. The bureaucratic systems created to manage Gong farmers became models for other forms of municipal regulation and helped establish the principle that city governments had responsibility for public health and sanitation. Religious institutions were also affected. Churches and monasteries were major employers of Gong farmer services, and the regulation of waste removal became intertwined with religious laws about cleanliness and purity. Some religious communities developed their own waste management systems specifically to avoid dependence on the secular Gong farmer profession. The military impact was sometimes crucial. Castles and fortified cities needed reliable waste management to survive long sieges. A castle with overflowing privies would become uninhabitable long before the food ran out. Some military campaigns succeeded or failed based on the sanitation systems of the cities they attacked or defended. Gong farmers influenced medieval attitudes toward cleanliness, privacy, and social hierarchy. The fact that waste removal was handled by a despised class of specialists reinforced the idea that contact with human waste was deeply shameful and contaminating. This affected everything from religious practices to social customs around bathing and personal hygiene. The technical innovations developed by Gong farmers had broader impacts on medieval society. The tools and techniques they created for moving heavy loads, working in confined spaces, and dealing with dangerous materials were adapted for other purposes. Some of the rope and pulley systems used by Gong farmers influenced the development of construction and mining equipment. Perhaps most importantly, Gong farmers demonstrated that medieval society could create professional solutions to large-scale urban problems. The fact that cities could organize, regulate, and maintain waste removal services showed a level of administrative sophistication that contradicts stereotypes about medieval incompetence and backwardness. The work of Gong farmers made possible the concentration of people, commerce, and culture that defined medieval urban life. Without them, the great cities of medieval Europe couldn't have existed. The cathedrals, universities, markets, and cultural institutions that we associate with medieval civilization were all built on the foundation of effective waste management provided by these despised but essential workers. Number 10. Modern reflection. As we reach the end of our journey through the horrifying world of medieval Gong farmers, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what their story tells us about both the past and the present. These men, working in conditions so disgusting that most of us can barely imagine them, were doing something that we still depend on today. Every time you flush a toilet, every time you expect waste to simply disappear from your life, you're benefiting from systems that grew out of the work that Gong farmers pioneered centuries ago. The obvious comparison is to modern sanitation workers. The people who collect our garbage, maintain our sewage systems, and clean up the messes that urban life creates are the direct descendants of medieval Gong farmers. They're doing the same essential work of keeping cities habitable, just with better technology, better safety equipment, and hopefully better social respect. But the comparison reveals both how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. Modern sanitation workers still face dangers from toxic gases, chemical exposure, and contaminated materials. They still work in conditions that most people find disgusting and prefer not to think about. They still perform work that's absolutely essential to urban civilization, but often goes unnoticed and unappreciated by the general public. The social stigma has lessened, but it hasn't disappeared entirely. Sanitation work is still looked down upon by many people as a job for those who couldn't find anything better. The workers are still often invisible to the rest of society, doing their jobs early in the morning or late at night, when most people don't have to see or think about what they're doing. What has changed dramatically is our understanding of public health and the importance of sanitation. We now know that waste management is one of the most important factors in preventing disease and maintaining livable cities. Modern medical science has proven what medieval people only suspected, that proper waste disposal is literally a matter of life and death for urban populations. The technology has also transformed beyond recognition. Modern sewage treatment plants, automated collection systems, and chemical processing methods have turned waste management into a sophisticated industrial process. What once required men to climb into pits of human excrement by torchlight is now handled by machines and automated systems that can process enormous amounts of waste safely and efficiently. But perhaps the most important change is in how we think about the people who do this work. While social stigma still exists, we've also developed a greater appreciation for the skilled, dangerous, and essential nature of sanitation work. Modern sanitation workers are more likely to have job security, health benefits, safety training, and legal protections than their medieval predecessors. The story of Gong farmers also reminds us how much we take for granted in our modern world. Every flush toilet represents centuries of innovation in waste management. Every sewage treatment plant embodies knowledge gained through the trial and error of generations of waste removal specialists. The clean water that flows from our taps is possible because we've learned to keep human waste away from water sources. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine that medieval life was somehow simpler or more authentic than modern existence. But the reality of Gong farmers reminds us that medieval urban life included horrors that most of us would find completely unbearable. The smell, the disease, the constant presence of human waste, and the danger of contamination were daily realities for medieval city dwellers. The high wages that Gong farmers earned, despite their social rejection, also tells us something important about how societies value different types of work. The market recognized that Gong farming was essential and dangerous work that deserved high compensation, even when social attitudes refused to grant the workers any respect. This tension between economic necessity and social prejudice is something we still see today in many essential but stigmatized professions. The regulatory systems that medieval cities developed to manage Gong farmers show that even centuries ago, people understood that waste management required careful coordination between government, private contractors, and property owners. The detailed laws governing when, where, and how Gong farmers could work demonstrate a level of administrative sophistication that challenges stereotypes about medieval incompetence. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Gong farmers reminds us that civilization depends on people willing to do unglamorous, dangerous, and often disgusting work to keep the rest of society functioning. Whether we're talking about medieval Gong farmers, modern sanitation workers, or any of the countless other essential workers whose jobs most people prefer not to think about, the lesson is the same. The next time you complain about your job, think about the Gong farmers working by torchlight in medieval London, climbing into pits of human waste because someone had to do it and society would collapse without their work. The next time you flush a toilet and expect the waste to simply disappear, remember the generations of workers who developed the systems that make that convenience possible. The next time you see a sanitation worker, a sewage maintenance crew, or anyone else whose job involves cleaning up the messes that the rest of us create, remember that they're carrying on a tradition of essential, life-saving work that goes back to the earliest days of urban civilization. Gong farmers were heroes in the most literal sense, people who risked their lives and health to save others, even though they received no recognition or respect for their sacrifices. They worked in conditions that would defeat most people, faced dangers that would terrify the bravest soldiers, and performed services that kept entire cities from collapsing into disease and chaos. Their story is a reminder that every civilization depends on people willing to do whatever needs to be done, no matter how horrible, dangerous, or thankless the work might be. It's a reminder that the most essential work is often the least glamorous, and that the people who keep society functioning are often the ones society prefers to forget about. In our modern world of clean bathrooms, automated waste disposal, and sophisticated sewage treatment, it's easy to forget the human cost of urban sanitation. But the story of medieval Gong farmers reminds us that behind every convenience we take for granted, there are people whose work, sacrifice, and willingness to face unpleasant realities make our comfortable lives possible. So the next time you flip a light switch, turn on a tap, or flush a toilet, take a moment to appreciate not just the technology that makes these things work, but the countless generations of workers who developed these systems through trial, error, danger, and sacrifice. The Gong farmers of medieval Europe were part of that long chain of human effort that connects their torchlit horror to our modern convenience. They remind us that civilization is not just about art, culture, and high ideals. It's also about the willingness of some people to do whatever dirty work needs to be done so that the rest of us can live in clean, safe, healthy communities. That's a lesson as relevant today as it was 600 years ago when Gong farmers were climbing into waste pits to keep medieval cities from drowning in their own filth. As we reach the end of our journey through the horrifying world of medieval Gong farmers, it's worth taking a much deeper look at what their story tells us about human nature, civilization, and the price we pay for the communities we build. This isn't just a tale about disgusting medieval jobs. It's a story that reveals fundamental truths about how societies work, who does the dirty work that keeps us all alive, and what we owe to the people whose sacrifices make our comfortable lives possible. The story of Gong farmers forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about civilization. Every advanced society, from ancient Rome to modern America, depends absolutely on people willing to do work that the rest of us find too disgusting, too dangerous, or too degrading to handle ourselves. We create these comfortable, clean spaces where we can live and work and raise our families. But those spaces only exist because someone else is willing to deal with all the horrible mess that comfort creates. Think about it this way. Right now, as you're reading this, there are people working in sewage treatment plants, handling waste that would make medieval Gong farmers proud. There are people cleaning up toxic spills, removing asbestos from buildings, processing slaughterhouse waste, cleaning crime scenes, and doing thousands of other jobs that keep our society functioning, but that most of us never want to think about. These modern essential workers are the direct descendants of medieval Gong farmers, still doing the work that nobody else wants to do, but that absolutely has to be done. What makes the story of Gong farmers particularly powerful is how it reveals the hypocrisy and contradiction at the heart of how we think about work and social value. Medieval society paid Gong farmers extremely well because the market recognized that their work was essential and dangerous. But at the same time, that same society treated them as social outcasts, banned them from normal social activities, and created laws that essentially made them a separate class of people. This contradiction still exists today, just in different forms. We call certain workers essential during crises like the COVID pandemic, but we don't pay them like they're essential. We depend completely on sanitation workers, agricultural laborers, slaughterhouse workers, home health aides, and countless other people doing difficult, often dangerous work, but we structure our economy so that these essential jobs pay poverty wages while people who push numbers around on computers make millions. The medieval approach was actually more honest in some ways. They paid Gong farmers well because they recognized that nobody would do such horrible work for normal wages. Modern society has found ways to force people into essential but undesirable work through economic pressure, immigration status, and other forms of coercion that medieval people didn't have available. The story of Gong farmers also reveals something important about human resilience and dignity. These men were doing work that would break most people, facing dangers that would terrify trained soldiers, and dealing with social rejection that would destroy many people's sense of self-worth. Yet they developed their own communities, their own professional standards, their own ways of supporting each other and maintaining dignity in impossible circumstances. The Gong farmers created informal guilds that protected their interests, negotiated better working conditions, and maintained quality standards for their profession. They formed marriages and families within their community, developed their own social traditions, and found ways to take pride in work that society despised. They proved that human dignity can survive almost any circumstances, and that people can create meaning and community even in the most difficult situations. This resilience is something we see in modern essential workers as well. The people who do our society's most difficult and dangerous work often develop strong communities, professional pride, and ways of finding meaning in their labor that the rest of us don't understand or appreciate. They create their own cultures, their own support systems, and their own ways of maintaining dignity in jobs that society undervalues. The technological changes that have transformed waste management since medieval times are obviously enormous and important. Modern sewage systems, treatment plants, and automated collection methods have made waste management infinitely safer, more efficient, and less horrible for the workers involved. But the fundamental human element hasn't changed. Someone still has to maintain those systems, repair them when they break, and deal with the problems that automation can't handle. What has changed, hopefully for the better, is our understanding of public health and the importance of sanitation work. We now know scientifically what medieval people only suspected, that proper waste management is literally a matter of life and death for urban populations. Modern medicine has proven that sanitation workers are doing genuinely life-saving work that prevents disease outbreaks and makes healthy communities possible. But our scientific understanding hasn't necessarily translated into social respect. Many people still look down on sanitation work as something for people who couldn't find better jobs. Many people still prefer not to think about what happens to their waste after they flush it away. The invisibility that medieval cities imposed on Gong farmers by making them work at night has been replaced by a different kind of invisibility, where we simply ignore the people who do this work and pretend it happens by magic. The regulatory systems that medieval cities developed to manage Gong farmers were surprisingly sophisticated and reveal important lessons about governance and public policy. These cities understood that waste management was too important to leave to the free market alone. They created detailed licensing systems, quality standards, price regulations, and safety requirements because they knew that without proper oversight, waste removal could become even more dangerous and ineffective. Modern cities have much more sophisticated regulatory systems for sanitation, but the basic principle is the same. Waste management is a public service that requires government oversight, regulation, and often direct government provision because the market alone won't provide adequate service to everyone who needs it. The laws that required Gong farmers to work at night were partly about protecting public sensibilities, but they were also about protecting public health. Medieval people understood that waste removal, while essential, was also dangerous to public health if not done properly. The regulations were attempts to balance the need for this work with the need to protect the general population from contamination and disease. This tension between individual needs and public health is something we still struggle with today. How do we ensure that essential but dangerous work gets done while protecting both the workers and the general public? How do we balance economic efficiency with safety and health concerns? How do we make sure that the costs and benefits of necessary but unpleasant work are distributed fairly? The story of Gong farmers also raises important questions about how we remember and honor the people who make our lives possible. These men were absolutely essential to medieval urban civilization, yet they've been largely forgotten by history. Most historical accounts of medieval cities focus on kings, merchants, craftsmen, and religious leaders, but rarely mention the Gong farmers whose work made those cities habitable. This historical invisibility continues today. We build monuments to politicians, entrepreneurs, and military leaders, but rarely to sanitation workers, agricultural laborers, or other essential workers whose daily efforts keep society functioning. We teach children about the achievements of famous individuals, but not about the collective labor that makes civilization possible. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Gong farmers reminds us that our individual comfort and safety always depends on other people's willingness to face discomfort and danger on our behalf. Every time we benefit from clean streets, functional sewage systems, safe drinking water, or any of the other conveniences of modern life, we're benefiting from the work of people who deal with things we don't want to handle ourselves. This creates moral obligations that most of us prefer not to think about. If we benefit from other people's difficult and dangerous work, don't we owe them more than just market wages? Don't we owe them respect, decent working conditions, healthcare, job security, and a voice in how their work is organized? Don't we owe them recognition for the essential contributions they make to our well-being? The medieval system of paying Gong farmers, well, while socially rejecting them, was clearly inadequate and unfair. But at least it acknowledged that people doing essential but undesirable work deserved economic compensation for their sacrifices. Modern systems that force people into essential work through economic desperation while providing minimal compensation seem even more unfair. The story of Gong farmers also challenges us to think more honestly about what civilization actually requires. It's easy to focus on the beautiful, inspiring aspects of human culture, the art and literature and music and architecture that represent our highest achievements. But all of that beauty and inspiration rests on a foundation of practical work that someone has to do, much of it unglamorous, difficult, and even disgusting. Medieval cathedrals are magnificent expressions of human creativity and spiritual aspiration, but they could only be built in cities that had effective waste management systems. Renaissance art and literature flourished in urban centers that depended on Gong farmers and other essential workers to remain habitable. The universities, libraries, and cultural institutions that preserved and advanced human knowledge existed because someone was willing to do the practical work that made urban civilization possible. This doesn't diminish the value of art, culture, and intellectual achievement, but it does remind us that these higher accomplishments are built on a foundation of practical labor that we need to value and respect more than we typically do. The environmental implications of the Gong farmer story are also worth considering. Medieval waste disposal methods were obviously primitive and often environmentally destructive. Gong farmers would dump waste in areas that would contaminate soil and water sources, creating environmental problems that would persist for generations. But medieval cities produced much less waste per person than modern cities do, and most of their waste was organic material that would eventually decompose. Modern waste streams include enormous amounts of plastic, chemicals, and other materials that don't decompose naturally and create much more serious long-term environmental problems. The people who handle our modern waste streams face different challenges than medieval Gong farmers did, but they're still dealing with the fundamental problem of what to do with all the stuff that human communities produce but don't want. Recycling workers, hazardous waste specialists, and environmental cleanup crews are modern versions of Gong farmers, dealing with the unwanted byproducts of our comfortable lives. Climate change and environmental degradation are forcing us to think more seriously about waste, consumption, and the environmental costs of our lifestyles. The people who do environmental cleanup work, who process our recycling, who deal with toxic waste sites, are doing essential work that will determine whether human civilization can continue in its current form. The story of Gong farmers reminds us that someone always has to deal with the mess that human communities create. The question is whether we'll structure our societies to treat the people who do this work with respect and fairness, or whether we'll continue to exploit their desperation and then forget about them when their work is done. Looking at the global economy today, we can see patterns that are very similar to what happened with medieval Gong farmers. The most essential work, the work that keeps the global supply chains functioning, is often done by people who are paid the least and have the least social and political power. Agricultural workers, factory workers, domestic workers, and many others do work that's absolutely essential to modern life, but that pays poverty wages and offers little respect or security. Just like medieval Gong farmers, These modern essential workers often come from marginalized communities and have few other economic options. They do work that more privileged people don't want to do, under conditions that more privileged people wouldn't tolerate, for wages that more privileged people wouldn't accept. The parallel extends to the social invisibility as well. Medieval cities made Gong farmers work at night, so respectable people wouldn't have to see them. Modern global supply chains hide essential workers in factories, fields, and processing plants that consumers never see. We benefit from their work every day, but we structure our economy so that we don't have to think about the conditions they face or the sacrifices they make. This invisibility isn't accidental. It serves the interests of the people who benefit from essential workers' labor to keep that work and those workers out of sight. If consumers had to confront the reality of how their food was grown, their clothes were made, or their electronic devices were assembled, they might demand better working conditions and higher wages, which would increase costs for everyone else. The story of Gong farmers suggests that this kind of exploitation and invisibility is not inevitable. Medieval cities could have structured their waste management systems differently. They could have provided better working conditions, better social support, and better integration of Gong farmers into normal community life. The fact that they didn't reflect choices about values and priorities, not technical or economic necessities. Similarly, modern societies could choose to structure essential work differently. We could provide better wages, working conditions, and social support for the people who do the work that keeps our communities functioning. We could make these jobs visible and respected rather than hidden and stigmatized. The fact that we don't reflect our choices about values and priorities, not inevitable economic loss. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a temporary glimpse of what it might look like to actually value essential workers. For a few months, we called them heroes, acknowledged their importance, and even provided some additional compensation and support. But as the immediate crisis passed, most of that recognition and support disappeared, and we went back to taking essential workers for granted. The pandemic also revealed how quickly our comfortable lives can collapse when essential workers aren't available to do their jobs. Supply chain disruptions, food shortages, and other problems reminded us just how dependent we are on people whose work we normally ignore. Yet this lesson doesn't seem to have translated into lasting changes in how we structure work and compensation. The story of medieval Gong farmers offers some guidance for how we might think differently about these issues. First, it reminds us that essential work has always existed and always will exist. No amount of technological advancement eliminates the need for people to do difficult, dangerous, and unpleasant work to keep society functioning. Second, it shows us that societies have choices about how to organize and compensate this work. Medieval cities chose to pay Gong farmers well, but treat them as social outcasts. We could choose different approaches that provide both economic security and social respect. Third, it demonstrates the importance of regulation and oversight. Medieval cities understood that waste management was too important to leave entirely to market forces. They created detailed regulatory systems because they knew that without proper oversight, essential services would either not be provided at all or would be provided in ways that created additional problems. Fourth, it reveals the importance of community and solidarity among workers doing difficult jobs. Gong farmers created their own support systems, professional standards, and ways of maintaining dignity in impossible circumstances. Modern essential workers need similar community support and solidarity to advocate for better conditions and recognition. Finally, the story of Gong farmers reminds us that individual comfort and safety always depends on collective labor and mutual support. The myth of individual self-reliance falls apart as soon as you think seriously about all the ways your daily life depends on other people's work. The water you drink, the food you eat, the waste that disappears from your life, the roads you drive on, the electricity that powers your home. All of this depends on networks of workers whose labor makes your individual life possible. This interdependence creates moral obligations. If your well-being depends on other people's work, then you have responsibilities to ensure that those people are treated fairly, compensated adequately, and given the support they need to do their jobs safely and with dignity. The story of medieval Gong farmers is ultimately a story about power, justice, and the kind of society we want to create. These men were essential workers who kept medieval cities from collapsing into disease and chaos. But they were also exploited workers whose labor was extracted under conditions that no one should have to accept. Their story challenges us to think about who does the essential work in our own society, how those workers are treated, and what we owe to the people whose sacrifices make our comfortable lives possible. It reminds us that behind every clean, safe, comfortable space, there are people dealing with mess, danger, and difficulty so that others don't have to. Most importantly, it reminds us that these arrangements aren't natural or inevitable. They're choices. We can choose to structure work, compensation, and social recognition differently. We can choose to make essential work visible rather than hidden, respected rather than stigmatized, adequately compensated rather than exploited. The Gong farmers of medieval Europe couldn't choose differently. They lived in societies with limited options, rigid social hierarchies, and primitive understanding of public health and worker safety. But we have more choices. We have better technology, more resources, and better understanding of how to organize work safely and fairly. The question is whether we'll use those advantages to create more just and equitable systems, or whether we'll continue to structure society so that some people have to sacrifice their health, safety, and dignity so that others can live comfortable lives. The legacy of medieval Gong farmers is a challenge to do better, to remember the people whose work makes our lives possible, to structure our economies and societies so that essential work is rewarded rather than exploited, to ensure that the benefits and burdens of civilization are shared more fairly among all the people who contribute to making it possible. That's a challenge that's as relevant today as it was 600 years ago when Gong farmers were climbing into waste pits to keep medieval cities alive. The specific work has changed, but the fundamental questions about justice, dignity, and mutual obligation remain the same. How we answer those questions will determine what kind of society we create and what kind of legacy we leave for future generations. The Gong farmers of medieval Europe remind us that civilization always depends on people willing to do whatever needs to be done, no matter how difficult or unpleasant. The least we can do is ensure that those people are treated with the respect, support, and compensation that their essential contributions deserve. The lessons from their lives echo through the centuries, challenging us to examine our own society's treatment of essential workers. Every person who maintains our sewage systems, cleans our hospitals, processes our waste, or performs any of the countless other jobs that keep modern civilization functioning deserves our recognition, respect, and support. They are the inheritors of a tradition that stretches back through history to those brave, desperate, and essential men who climbed into medieval waste pits so that cities could survive. In the end, the story of Gong farmers is a story about all of us. It's about the choices we make as a society, the values we prioritize, and the kind of world we want to create. It's about remembering that behind every convenience we enjoy, every comfort we take for granted, and every clean, safe space we inhabit, there are people whose work, sacrifice, and dedication make those things possible. The Gong farmers worked in darkness, both literal and metaphorical. They labored in the shadows of medieval society, essential but invisible, needed but forgotten. Their story is a reminder that we cannot afford to leave anyone in the shadows. We cannot afford to ignore the people whose work sustains us, or to treat as disposable the individuals whose labor makes our lives possible. As we've journeyed through the horrifying details of their daily lives, the dangerous conditions they faced, and the social rejection they endured, we've also discovered something profound about human resilience, dignity, and the bonds that hold societies together. The Gong farmers created community in impossible circumstances, maintained professional standards in the face of disgust and danger, and found ways to preserve their humanity while doing work that would break most people. Their story teaches us that no work is truly degrading if it serves human needs and is performed with skill and dedication. What degrades people is not the nature of their work, but how society chooses to treat them. The shame belonged not to the Gong farmers who risked their lives every night to keep cities habitable, but to the society that needed their services while refusing them dignity and respect. Today, as we flush our toilets and expect our waste to disappear, as we walk on clean streets and breathe relatively clean air, as we live in cities that would be impossible without sophisticated sanitation systems, We owe a debt of gratitude that stretches back through the centuries. We owe it to the Gong farmers of medieval Europe, to the sanitation workers of today, and to all the people throughout history who have been willing to handle the dirty work that civilization requires. Most importantly, we owe it to ourselves to build a society that treats all essential work with the dignity it deserves. The Gong farmers couldn't change their circumstances, but we can change ours. We can choose to remember rather than forget, to honor rather than ignore, and to support rather than exploit the people whose labor sustains us all. The next time you encounter a sanitation worker, a janitor, a farm worker, or anyone else doing the essential work that keeps our world functioning, remember the Gong farmers. Remember that these modern essential workers are carrying on a tradition of service that goes back to the earliest days of urban civilization. Remember that their work is not just a job, but a form of public service that makes all of our lives possible. And remember that how we treat them says everything about who we are as a society and what kind of future we want to build. The Gong farmers of medieval Europe deserved better than they got. We have the opportunity to ensure that their modern descendants receive the recognition, respect, and support that centuries of essential workers have earned through their sacrifice and service. That is their legacy and our challenge. To build a world where no one has to work in the shadows, where essential work is honored rather than hidden, and where the people who keep civilization running are valued as the heroes they truly are. The Gong farmers of medieval Europe remind us that such a world is not just possible, but necessary, if we want to create a society worthy of the sacrifices that built it.